はい、皆様ごきげんよう。 JCU インサイトのお時間です。今日はですね、オーストラリアで非常に大人気を博しました元首相のアボットさんをお迎えしまして、 JCU インサイト特別編を相葉とそれから山岡先生のコラボでお届けしたいと考えております。私の今回司会を中心でさせていただきまして、山岡先生に質問者としてですね、アボットさんにいろいろ伺ってみたいと思っております。ではアボットさん、今日はお忙しい中ありがとうございます。では今から山岡の方から中心に質問をいろいろさせていただきます。
Mr. Abbott, once again, thank you very much for joining us today. Very honored to see you. How was Japan?
Look, it's always good to be in Japan. I was sorry to be there for such a sad business, but on the other hand, I was pleased to be able to give suitable honour to the late Abe Shinzo, who was a great friend of Australia, and he was also a great friend to me personally. So I was pleased to be able to be there as part of a large Australian delegation. We had our Prime Minister, Mr Albanese, we had Mr Howard, we had Mr Turnbull, as well as myself. So we had 4 Prime Ministers from Australia,
That's great.
which was, I think, a pretty good way for Australia to honour someone who wasn't just a great friend of Australia and not just the longest-serving post-war Japanese Prime Minister, but was a statesman of global consequence.
Yeah, that was very impressive. The present Prime Minister and 3 other former Prime Ministers, including yourself. That was very, very impressive, and we're very pleased to see that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now, please let me ask you some questions. To start with, in your eye, how is Australia doing overall in terms of recovering from COVID and other international turbulence?
Well, these are very challenging times. Economically and strategically, they are probably the most testing times we've had for many decades. COVID obviously brought on a whole lot of global supply chain shocks. China's increasing belligerence, the Beijing regime's increasing belligerence has also resulted in some supply chain shocks and indeed some disruptions to trade, particularly Australian trade. So there's a lot that needs to be done, and I worry that some of the trends in our politics are actually counterproductive, particularly given the economic turbulence we face. For instance, the new government has entrenched a 43% emissions reduction target in legislation, and that's going to add to cost of living pressure at a time when we already have significant inflationary pressure. So I think these are difficult times, and I worry that, at least for the moment, in some areas at least, we're going down the wrong path. Now, I should also say that the Albanese government, to its credit, has pretty much continued the former Morrison government's stance on strategic issues. The Albanese government is every bit as enthusiastically in support of the Quad, of which Abe Shinzo was the founder, the father. The Albanese government has been suitably strong against the Beijing regime's bullying, and has been very active to try to ensure that China's push into the Pacific is suitably countered by democracies such as Australia.
Australia is supposed to be the most self-sufficient country, isn't it? And then we expect Australia to be the most resilient under such difficult times.
Well, one of the things that I used to say when I was Prime Minister is that Australia can be a source of energy, resource and food security to other countries. We certainly can be all those things. The paradox is that we are a country with superabundant reserves of coal and of gas and of uranium, but we're making increasingly little use of those self-same resources here in this country. And in fact, we make no use domestically, or almost no use domestically, of our uranium. And if we are serious about getting to net zero anytime soon, the only way to do that while keeping the lights on is to move to nuclear power.
Okay. Well, it sounds like a bit of the complex or paradox you have. From myself again, this is going to be a little bit serious questions. If China attacks Taiwan, do you think the U.S. will come to defend Taiwan, as Joe Biden repeatedly stated?
Look, that's the $64 question, isn't it? It's interesting that 4 times now, President Biden has been quite emphatic that the United States would defend Taiwan in the event of an unprovoked attack across the straits. Each time, officials have been at pains to say that the policy of strategic ambiguity has not changed. My own suspicion is that the President, quite cleverly perhaps, while keeping the policy, has changed what the policy means. It's also interesting that senior people in Japan have been much more forthright in their statements about Taiwan. In fact, one of Abe-san's recent speeches, I think he said a Taiwan contingency would be a Japan contingency and therefore an American contingency. There's absolutely no doubt that if Japan came to Taiwan's assistance, that would almost certainly involve the Americans, given the much closer alliance relationship between America and Japan than there currently is between America and Taiwan. So look, I think it's very important that the democracies raise the cost to China of any aggression across the straits. And let's face it, if it's 1.4 billion Chinese against 23 million Taiwanese, that's a pretty unequal struggle. But if it is China against a democratic coalition, that's a different thing altogether. And in the end, if you are dealing with a potential bully, you've got to show strength. That's the only way to deal with a potential bully. If Putin had been aware of just how much help the Western democracies would give to Ukraine, I doubt he would have begun his invasion. And certainly if there had been Western troops in Ukraine, as there are in the Baltic states, Poland and other NATO members, there's no doubt whatsoever that aggression would have been deterred.
Okay, well, I hope Biden is cleverly behaving. I just hope. Okay, now the next one. But what do you think Australia will do if the US does not actually come to help Taiwan? Will that can happen?
Well, that's a very good question as well. I imagine that Australia will act as a very close ally of the United States. If America were involved, I think it's almost inevitable that Australia is involved. I wouldn't want to speculate otherwise.
Yeah, I know this is a very difficult question because the stance of both Japan and Australia very similar. Those countries are in the position to help the United States. So that means the assumption is the US is there. Yeah.
On the other hand, I mean, Japan is part of the first island chain. Taiwan is part of the first island chain.
That's right.
And if Taiwan were under the sway of an unfriendly power, that would obviously be very important for Japan.
Yes.
Very significant for Japan.
Yes.
So look, as I said, the last thing we want is a horrific conflict. I mean, we've seen the ramifications of the Ukraine war. Any war in East Asia would have disastrous consequences that are an order of magnitude greater than those flowing from the Ukraine conflict. So we must do everything we humanly can to avoid conflict across the Taiwan Straits. But I think the only way to avoid that is to raise the costs to China of any attempt to alter the status quo by force.
Right. So we need to build up the deterrence against China. Yeah. As you remember, the Shinzo Abe correctly stated the Taiwan crisis is Japan's crisis. But most certainly, China will threat Japan by the nuclear attack. Then that's a difficult situation.
Look, this is why it's absolutely essential that the Beijing regime is under no misapprehension that any move across the Taiwan Straits would be easy or relatively painless for them.
That's right. Now, the next question could be even more difficult. But assuming war over Taiwan begins, how much economic and military damage can Australian public opinion tolerate before giving up? Because as we've seen, once war starts, those European allies, they're very supportive of Ukraine. But in actual fact, they are reliant on the gas supply from Russia and so on. They can't really tolerate the economic downturn or as such and hardship in the daily life. So what do you think?
Well, as I said, the disruptions attendant on the Ukraine conflict are relatively minor compared to the disruptions that would be attendant on any conflict across the Taiwan Straits, which is again why it's critical that we do everything possible to let the Chinese government know that there are no winners here, and ultimately the biggest loser could easily be China itself.
Yeah, that's right. We have to make that
correct
that way.
Correct.
Now, the next question is relatively simpler. Do you think that Japan should join the AUKUS?
Well, look, I certainly think that Japan is a very serious country. Very serious country. It's the world's third largest economy. It's a very significant military power, notwithstanding the constitutional limitations and the spending limitations that Japan has imposed on itself. One of Abe-san's great legacies is the, I think, growing realisation amongst the Japanese people that it is important for Japan to take its place as a normal country.
That's right.
In the wider world. We all know that bad things have happened in the past, but we can't live in the past. We've got to live in the present and look to the future. And I think that it will be a better future if Japan, as the leading democracy of the Western Pacific, takes its rightful place in the councils of the free world. So, look, I certainly would like to see an ever closer strategic relationship between Japan and the other major democracies. Plainly, AUKUS unites Australia with our two great and powerful friends, but Japan is also a great and powerful friend, and let's make that friendship as deep as it possibly can be.
I still remember your speech when the Shinzo Abe came to Canberra to give a speech at the Parliament. You said that the joint press conference give Japan a fair go. That was a historical message.
Well, thank you very much. And I can remember, I mean, first of all, on that speech, I was incredibly honoured, and I think Australia was honoured when Abe-san chose to speak in English to our parliament because he had to make quite an effort to do that, but it was wonderful that he did. The other point I probably should make, it's a personal point. I mean, I really enjoyed Abe-san's company in a whole lot of different contexts, but I do remember at the East Asia Summit at the end of 2014, there were 4 of us talking, and all of a sudden the Chinese Premier started literally berating Abe-san over things that had happened in the 1930s, and it was quite an awkward moment. And luckily I was able to diffuse it by saying very loudly to the Sultan of Brunei, who was in the knot of people, well, you must be appalled at what the British did to you. And that interrupted the flow of the Chinese Premier's language. And then I was able to say, history is a good teacher, but a bad master. And the way so many people in the Chinese leadership have tried to use the past as a weapon against Japan for the future, I just think is quite wrong. And if there's one thing about contemporary Japan, which I think is absolutely crystal clear, is that Japan, like Germany, well and truly assimilated the lessons of the Second World War. And I don't believe there's a militarist bone in the Japanese body politic at all. Not a single militarist bone left in the Japanese body politic. But I do think that Japan would be a doughty ally if needed.
Right, now this is going to be our final question for you. It's very simple. What would be your message for the Japanese public who lost Shinzo Abe?
I hope the people of Japan appreciate just what a respected and consequential figure he was in the wider world. It's said in our tradition that prophets have no honour in their own country. And Shinzo Abe had great honour in the wider world, and I hope the people of Japan appreciate that. I know there was a lot of controversy over the state funeral. I found that very hard to understand because he wasn't just the longest serving post-war Prime Minister. He was a figure of global significance, and the fact that so many leaders from around the world came to Tokyo as a mark of respect for him, I hope has suitably impressed the Japanese people.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, that's one of the main reasons for the government to decide to carry out the state funeral. And the media says, as you said, there's a big controversy and there are a lot of people out there opposing as such. But in actual fact, far more people are supportive. Yeah, and only some part of some people are against. That is still quite sad to see, quite disturbing. Yeah, but majority of the Japanese people were deeply missing Shinzo Abe, just like you.
Well, that's correct. And look, we have to accept that he's no longer with us, but I believe that we should honour his memory, and we should cherish his legacy, and we should treat him as an inspiration and an exemplar.
And finally, I'd like to say thank you to you on behalf of the Japanese people. Thank you to you and Australian people. The Australian people, with the government, did a lot of things for Shinzo Abe after the assassination without being asked. That was extremely impressive, and that was the proof, the manifestation of the deep friendship, true friendship between the two countries. I firmly believe that.
Me too.
Once again, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. ということでですね、皆様、オーストラリアと日本の絆、これからの未来、理解が一層深まったのではないでしょうか。それでは今日はここでお別れします。皆様、ごきげんよう。